Hi, I'm Marcin Kuśmierczyk. Welcome to Eastern Insights. Why does Eastern Europe's perspective on global affairs matter? Because here, history and geopolitics collide in ways that shape our world. Yet these voices often go unheard. This podcast bridges this gap. Each episode translates in-depth analysis from my Polish YouTube channel, Polityka Zagraniczna, which means international politics. For the last few years, this platform has dissected foreign policy, security, and the forces shaping Eastern Europe. Using AI tools like 11 Labs, we adapt these nuanced insights into English, preserving their depth while making them accessible to all. Whether we're unpacking Russia's latest moves, EU debates, or security challenges in Central Europe, our mission is simple: to foster informed dialogue by sharing Eastern Europe's untold stories. If you're curious about the world beyond headlines, subscribe now. Join me as we decode the complexities of global affairs, one Eastern European insight at a time.
It's been 6 weeks. 6 weeks since that ultimatum was issued by the leaders of France, Germany, Great Britain, and Poland in Kyiv. The message was clear. If Russia didn't agree to an unconditional ceasefire, powerful and swift sanctions would follow, designed to cripple their economy. On the surface, these seemed like actions designed to pressure Russia, but in practice, as I discussed in a separate piece, it was also a way to exert pressure on the United States. Macron, Starmer, Merz, and Tusk repeatedly emphasized that their actions aligned with Donald Trump's desire for a quick end to the war. They even suggested that the Americans would also impose significant sanctions. Yet, as we know, there has been no ceasefire, and the only new sanctions introduced since that Kyiv trip in early May, the 17th package from the European Union. Yes, new ships, companies, and individuals have been added to the sanctions list, but let's be frank, while these actions might be an inconvenience for Russia, they certainly won't lead to its collapse or to a ceasefire. When you consider the extremely sharp, unambiguous language used in Kyiv, this response looks very weak. That European threat? It turned out to be a bluff. A clear sign of either helplessness or a fundamental lack of will. It's worth re-emphasizing just how strong those words were in Kyiv. They spoke of lightning-fast, devastating sanctions, sanctions that had supposedly already been negotiated with the Americans, ready to be unleashed instantly. As I mentioned in my previous material on this subject, the Europeans' move was incredibly risky, because calling their bluff by both Russia and the United States exposes European helplessness. It reveals a lack of direct influence on the political process of this war, a war that, let's remember, directly concerns European security. What happened? Well, the Russians not only failed to implement any ceasefire, they actually intensified their shelling. And the Americans? They used Russia's alleged desire for negotiations as leverage, as long as it didn't mean implementing their own American sanctions. It seems America also wanted to show Europe that Washington couldn't be instrumentalized so easily, that a simple PR, media, and diplomatic maneuver wouldn't force them to change their stance on the Russian Federation. But here's where it gets interesting. This doesn't change the fact that America might soon find itself in a corner. Even though it's doing everything to threaten sanctions, rather than actually implementing them, if the US wants to maintain credibility, it will soon be forced to change its course towards the Russian Federation. Why? Because Donald Trump won't be able to escape the growing perception that Vladimir Putin is playing him. America calls for peace from Russia, and what does it get? An apparent openness to talks, coupled with an intensification of air attacks, even against civilian targets. This, at one point, even led Trump to state that Putin was crazy. However, Ukraine has also recently demonstrated an extraordinary ability to inflict pain on its opponent. In what I'd describe as a daring, almost cinematic operation, using drones launched from trucks, the Ukrainians destroyed at least a dozen Russian planes, including a strategic bomber. There are ongoing disputes about the exact number of machines destroyed and the precise value of the Russian losses, likely in the billions of dollars. But there's no doubt whatsoever about the informational, strategic, and political implications of this attack. They will be colossal. First, Ukraine has showcased a remarkable capacity for creative, asymmetrical warfare, leveraging new technologies to strike deep behind Russian lines. They hit an airport in deep Siberia. Second, the target was Russian strategic bombers, aircraft capable of carrying nuclear weapons. This is yet another example of Ukrainian actions, following the Kursk offensive, that aim to disrupt the image of Russia as an untouchable nuclear power, one that must not be attacked or defeated. Third, and this is extremely important, Ukraine has demonstrated that it can inflict very tangible losses on Russia without using Western equipment. The Americans might not like such an attack at all, because, up until now, the US has maintained significant control over the scale and direction of the Ukrainian response. The Americans were effectively managing the escalation. Fourth, on the other side of this fight for escalation dominance is, of course, Russia. They will certainly want to regain the informational initiative in this area. It's difficult not to anticipate an attack that goes beyond the grim, standard shelling we've been observing for months. And this brings us back to that very public, spectacular exchange at the White House, when Donald Trump told Zelensky, "You don't have any cards." This clearly conveyed the American perspective. If Washington decides the war is over, then it's over, because Ukraine supposedly lacks its own tools to continue fighting. Now, it's true that Ukraine is a country dependent on external support, but it's also worth noting that the Russians receive external support as well. Without Chinese production, without Iranian drones or drone technology, or even, for example, Korean recruits, things would probably be much harder for them. But in any case, Ukraine clearly has its own cards in its pocket, and they've just pulled out an ace. According to Forbes, the Ukrainian arms industry is set to produce up to 4 million drones this year. 4 million drones, and with a perspective of up to 10 million drones in production in the coming years. That is an abstract number.
And to top it off, as you can plainly see,
They're constantly seeking new, creative, and innovative ways to use this technology, ways that can truly inflict serious damage on the opponent. It's worth returning to the idea that the Russians, by trying to impose their political will on the Ukrainians by force, have chosen perhaps the worst possible method. If they had attempted to fracture this country along political fault lines, interfered in the political system, or tried to influence it culturally or economically, using oligarchy, promoting disintegration, leveraging economic influences or resource dependencies, perhaps it would have been much easier in the long run. But the Russians decided to conquer. And the Ukrainians, it turns out, can truly fight. Let's look at these events from a broader perspective. Take a moment and think about this. What would you have thought if someone told you 3 years ago, at the very beginning of the war, in February 2022, that in 3 years, after more than 1,000 days of conflict, Ukrainian drones would be destroying Russian strategic bombers parked at Siberian airports? It sounds completely absurd. Or that the Ukrainians would be building an arms industry capable of producing up to 10 million drones a year. These are the realities that this complex game is also about. And this highlights a major mistake. If you read analyses of this war, whether from the West or the East, especially those coming from former or current leaders, these analyses very often focus on the game of the rulers. This is the kind of thinking presented by Trump. It's a conviction that this is only a proxy war between the West, or specifically the United States, and Russia, and that if he wants to, he can turn off Ukrainian resistance with a snap of his fingers. Any analysis that doesn't take Ukraine into account as a significant factor in this war is, frankly, a serious mistake. Such an analysis is simply wrong, and it's crucial to remember this, especially from a much closer perspective than the American one. While American power is, of course, an absolutely key element in the entire political process surrounding this war, as evidenced by those negotiation photos which must pretend that Ukrainians and Russians are currently negotiating, it's clear that neither side is ready to accept the opponent's conditions. Everyone knows it's a trap. But the point is to avoid giving the impression that we don't want to talk. And why this charade? Because the Americans expect a conversation. Ukraine must pretend to negotiate, hoping to maintain prospects for American support. And Russia must pretend so that the Americans don't pass new sanctions. At the same time, both sides use this platform to achieve their own political and communicative goals. For Ukraine, a key goal is to maintain its status as a victim, a state that has been illegally attacked. This, of course, is in reference to the American administration's attitude, for whom this has clearly become less clear. And so, one of the documents the Ukrainians handed over to the Russians during the talks was a list of hundreds of abducted and Russified children. Russia, on the other hand, using its conditions and negotiation stance, demonstrates a conviction that it is winning this war and will achieve its political goals. Moscow, in fact, demanded Ukrainian capitulation, demobilization of its army, withdrawal of Ukrainians from areas Russia already recognizes as its own, and of course, the recognition of territorial changes. Additionally, a legal commitment to neutral status, Russian as the official language in Ukraine, or a numerical limitation of the Ukrainian army. In other words, Russia openly communicates that it will not back down on its goals and demands. It will not end this war until Ukraine becomes a Russian protectorate. That is the undeniable goal of this country. It cannot be called otherwise, because if these conditions were accepted, Ukraine would not only be a non-aligned state with a limited army, but Russia would also have influence over its international orientation and the right to interfere in its internal affairs, its very internal structure. And it's quite clear something like this is simply unacceptable. These are prohibitive conditions. And on one hand, this is nothing new, because Russia, since 2021, has set very maximalist goals in its demands and postulates. It says you have to refer to the sources of this war. And it's not just about Ukraine, I always remind you, but generally about narrowing zones of influence. But at the same time, these conditions, 3 years after the outbreak of the war, look quite absurd. After all, for 3 years, the Russians have been trying to expel Ukrainians from areas they've already managed to declare as their own. On one hand, these demands show enormous self-confidence, a conviction that Russia is fully capable of achieving its political goals, but also a huge dose of arrogance, because issuing such demands the day after the enemy destroyed what might be 1/3 of the strategic fleet of Russian bombers. And yes, these numbers about 1/3 might be misleading as they come from the Ukrainian side. But despite everything, these demands are simply detached from reality. And this is also intended to show that we can negotiate with America, which is like us, another power, and not with some little Russians, with whom, if necessary, we'll take a picture and pretend we're having a conversation. But here's the question. Aren't the Russians bending too much in this arrogance? I mean, isn't it too ostentatious? Aren't the Russians showing America too overtly that they're just playing with the idea of peace negotiations? That they're actually playing America, playing Trump, playing on the differences between Europe and America? Doesn't it become too ostentatious to avoid even an exceptionally mild response against the Russian Federation so far? And this brings us to another threat of sanctions. However, this time you can see some actions accompanying the words. And crucially, this time, the source of the sanctions isn't the president, but a bipartisan agreement in the U.S. Senate. Lindsey Graham, a Republican, and Democrat Richard Blumenthal are working on a solution that, if it came to fruition, could fundamentally change the Russian economy. The mechanism would be this. The United States would impose a 500% tariff on countries buying Russian energy resources. This would essentially be a de facto embargo on trade with the United States for anyone buying Russian oil or gas. So, it's an attempt to cut Russia off from its basic sources of income. The idea has wide support in the Senate, and the leaders of this initiative were recently in Kiev and Brussels. Ursula von der Leyen, interestingly, reportedly supported the idea, despite the fact that Europe still uses Russian energy resources, to a lesser extent, sometimes disguised as products from India or Kazakhstan. But still, the idea of hitting Russia by limiting its income from the sale of fossil fuels, of energy resources, is, of course, a very good one. It's a weak point of that country. It's a sensitive point of the Russian Federation's economy. It's obvious that they should hit there, and everyone has known this for a long time. But it hasn't happened. And there are very clear reasons why. The list of problems for introducing this type of solution is genuinely very, very long. Russian resources aren't entirely cut off from the markets. Only Russian influence is limited, for example, by the price of oil. Because completely cutting off Russian resources would be incredibly painful for those who use them. I mean, Are we ready for higher energy prices? Furthermore, is America truly able to impose a 500% tariff on India or the European Union? To cut off India or Europe from dealing with the United States simply to harm the Russian Federation? And if a clause in this document were to be activated, allowing for exceptions, wouldn't the document lose its power entirely?
The United States can revert to portraying Russia as an aggressor, tightening sanctions, and increasing the costs of Russian aggression in such a way that it would cease to be calculable by the Russians. But it can also choose another path, one the Americans have already openly signaled. This path leads to the idea that if the Russians and Ukrainians don't want to reach an agreement, then it's no longer our business. It means getting bored with negotiations and simply leaving. This would undoubtedly make the image or reputation of the United States in Europe unbearable. But at the same time, it would keep open communication channels with the Russian Federation. It would also be a very significant political decision. The possibility of such a decision has been openly communicated by the Americans, though it seems that, given the huge costs America would face at that time, it's still largely theoretical. In any case, as long as America's attitude towards Russia remains as ambivalent as it has been, as long as the Americans only threaten with sanctions and don't do anything that could seriously harm the Russian Federation and thereby force it to rethink its negotiating position, the stronger the image of Trump, who is being played by Putin. The more you can have the impression that Russia is playing America, playing and tearing it apart. The demand for Ukraine's capitulation in the current military, political, and economic situation is a glaring obstacle to peaceful negotiations. This should be a reason for a deep rethinking of their attitude towards Russia for the Americans. It should be. And will it be? We'll see soon. I'd like to thank you for your attention today. Your support is truly very important to me. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you all soon.